Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I see one more person still in the waiting room, so I'll give them a second to join and then we shall kick things off. Happy Thursday, everyone. I think it's Thursday most places in the world, not everywhere. Thank you so much for joining us from wherever it is that you are. This is day 3 of the Mojaloop PI19 online community meeting. This is essentially your day. This is the day when you get to hear pitches from potential work streams, and then you get to cast your vote. And your vote is essentially your say in the priorities that we should work on, in setting the priorities for this convening. What you will be voting for at some point this day is a list of work streams, and you should tell us which ones you feel are the highest priority. And I'll go into the voting in a second, but how we will split this day is into 3 main sections. Well, let's say 4. For those of you guys who have been here with us before, you're familiar with this process. For those of you guys who are new, this is for your benefit. We will start with Paul Macon leading a product council session where everyone will get an opportunity to hear a couple of words from each of some presentations from each of the various work streams that we're hoping to have going into the next PI. That's the first section. After that, we will take a break. So after Paul and the roadmap presentations, we will take a break. And then after the break or during the break, you will each have a chance to make a vote. So we will, at that point, we will have a slide deck with a link, as well as the link will be placed in the chat for you to vote. And each person gets 3 votes. You can apportion those votes as you wish. You can use all 3 votes for one work stream or apportion them equally to different places. That's entirely up to you. And then the top 3 work streams at the end of the voting, we will come back after the break and have work stream breakouts. The work stream breakouts will go on for an hour. After the work stream breakouts, we'll have another quick 10-minute break, and then we'll come up for report outs. So the various work streams will come back and give us their feedback or what the discussions have gone into. Summarize the discussions that they've had during the workstream breakouts. Then after that, we will go into our final session, which is the awards ceremony, where we recognize those in our community who have actively contributed. And celebrate those who are making a huge impact in our community, as well as crown this convening's trivia champion. So that is essentially the plan for the day. Get comfortable. I hope you're all ready for this one. I will pass it over to Mr. Paul Macon. Paul.
Thank you, Simeon. I'll just share my screen.
Sure.
In the traditional manner. And here I am, down here.
Yeah.
I'm going to keep this relatively short because it's far more interesting to hear from the work stream leads than it is from me. So I'll give a brief introduction and an update of where we've got so far. This agenda basically is a mirror of what Simeon just told you. So I want to really, first of all, tell you what's been happening over the last PI with regard to the product council. I'd say the last PI has, from my perspective, been slower than anticipated, for which I can only apologize. A combination of a vacation season. I was out with COVID for a couple of weeks, which was a bit of a killer for me, frankly, and just simply pressure of work. There's been just far too much to do, as I'm sure we all have. So we now have a clear plan, I think, for the next PI. This is the proposal, and I'm certainly very open for discussion around this. I'm planning that Product Council will have individual workstream meetings one per month for each work stream. I think it's probably the most sensible way of doing it. We only managed a couple in the last PI, so I'd like to make it a lot more regular, sort of semi-formal. I've had a problem with timings. I've had somebody in Seattle who was telling me that they just couldn't attend the various meetings I've tried to schedule. And of course, if I time it so that it works for Seattle, then it won't work for Adelaide. So the option, one option is to have alternate timing. So one month we go for something that suits Seattle, the next month we go for something that suits Adelaide. What I'll try and do is look to see who is interested in joining each individual workstream meeting and try and schedule accordingly. But that's no trivial task. And I'd appreciate the help of participants in scheduling, and you're likely to see much more use of Doodle in that case, or something similar. In addition to that, we started to look at business-led focus groups, one per work stream. That is not for the various business interests to determine what should be developed. It's to try and look towards the future and look at the evolving needs for the work stream. So the output of a business-led focus group is presented to the work stream meetings next time around to try and shape the future evolution. Separately from that, operator-led webinars, we need to improve our understanding of what the operators need. We've tried to schedule them. Again, scheduling has been my enemy in this. Trying to get something that suits everyone is a real challenge. But we need to understand real world needs much better. Having said that, I recognize that if we just focus on what the operators want, then perhaps we might be in a position where we're just focusing on the short term. We need to balance that against the medium long-term vision as to what the industry as a whole, the payment sector as a whole is heading towards, and we need to support that. So it's a kind of a balance. But again, the output of the operator-led webinars gets fed into the various workstream meetings. That's the plan. If anyone knows a really good online scheduler, then I'd be very happy to use it, because scheduling is my biggest nightmare. Moving on, these are the candidate work streams that I want people to present on. We have 8, but actually there's only 7, because the first one, PISP or 3PPI, is going to effectively be paused, and Sam will explain why. We have Forex, which is an extraordinarily important work stream, as I'm sure you heard from the last couple of days. Infrastructure is there because we do need support. We need a better understanding of the infrastructure needs and what support is available to help meet those needs. And that is where potentially the not just the operators, but also people like Innocent and his focus on hackathons, etc., could be a real help in helping to shape those requirements. The new settlement models, this goes hand in hand with Forex for me, though actually it extends much further than that. It's again, this is moving with the industry requirement. We can't feasibly in the medium long term have a service which only operates one settlement model at a time. We need to be able to support multiple for different types of transaction, including Forex. And since it goes hand in hand with Forex, I've asked Michael to talk to that. Digital identity integration, this is going to be one that is going to rise up the priority list, I feel. We know, for example, that World Bank are very interested in supporting work around integration between identity payments and also the whole electronic cash transfer market, seeing it as a three-way integration, and we need to try and spark support for that. Fraud integration, Greg, I really want you to talk to that because it is obviously important. The regulators are moving towards making this a requirement over the next couple of years, probably. Merchant payments, this one kind of, I think is extremely important. It kind of got downplayed a little because of essentially the people who were helping me drive that forward had other priorities. That Justice was very focused on fraud, and Lewis, as you all know, has now left the community. So that kind of slowed everything down. And vNext, we clearly need support for that. I haven't had confirmation from Pedro or Miguel that they're happy to talk about this, but here's a shout out to you guys. Perhaps you could give me 5 minutes on why the community should support vNext. That's the work streams we're going to consider. I'm not going to talk any further on these. I'm going to call for the individual workstream leads nominated here to actually perhaps talk for 5 minutes or so as to what support the community can give and how we can get the community involved. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and Sam, I'm really hoping you are ready to give me 5 minutes on why PISP is being paused for the moment.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I'd like to give a pitch as well, even if we are pausing the general work. We probably wouldn't need 5 minutes, but let me share my screen quickly. Paul, once you see it, if you can confirm, I'll proceed.
There you go. Go for it.
Yeah, so yesterday we discussed where we are with Mojaloop 3PPI. I think the small version, the brief version, TLDR version, is that third party from the implementation side is done, but we're looking forward to adoption. So we need adopters, and obviously many of our components, when faced with real world implications, had to be upgraded, customized, changed, fixed, things like that. So that is, I think, at this stage, a generic process that TPPI needs to go through as well. But the good news is that it is ready for that. It's ready for the big stage and for adoption and yeah, production readiness. So the only thing we are looking for is FSPs in markets such as in Myanmar or in other places who are willing to try out third-party services so that we can refine if needed and make sure that it works in real world. So far, we've mentioned that we have a standard version of the API. It is bundled with Mojaloop releases out of the box. The documentation is there. The last step here, we put a pause. We had to put a pause on developing an adapter for the Google Standard Payments GSP API because the API is going through changes, and there is a draft version for a newer version of the API. Which in fact is more aligned with the patterns that Mojaloop follows. So that is the reason why we had to put it on hold, so that a standard version for that is published, and then the workstream picks up from there. So following that, these are the few things I was thinking of for this upcoming PI. Is the first two are more of a call to adopters and implementers, saying if you are an FSP or if you are involved with an FSP or a third-party implementer who wants to try out Mojaloop's third-party functionality, that would be great. It would be great to try out. I think our core team and Google and others would like to support you on that and see where changes are needed, or if it works for you, great. So. But that would need some kind of connectors that need to be developed as part of the payment manager, or interfacing with the SDK and the third-party scheme adapters. Right now, it works with a combination of the testing toolkit. The third-party and scheme adapters provide the responses needed for end-to-end demos, but having a real core backend or a third-party backend would help validate this end-to-end. And then, of course, we are looking at some hackathons, third-party or PSP hackathons on the horizon. We want to make sure that the third-party functionality is ready for that. I don't know if there is a full-time or a work stream on this for this PI, like for a few weeks. We don't know when we'll restart, but hopefully soon. But if there is a hackathon happening and if there are issues or if support is needed, if the work stream is active, I think they'll take that up. Even outside of the work stream, the core team and Google, I think, can offer support based on bandwidth and other constraints. But the biggest thing might be that we do have the implementation, but there was a demo that was made with the Flutter app a while ago. But that's outdated, very outdated. It was, I think, about 3 years ago that was done, 2 to 3 years ago. So if we want to invest anything in this PI, it would be great to focus our energies on demo because as we saw earlier, we have a modular third-party functionality. It would be great to showcase that to adopters to show how it works and for them to show to other people. So any energy we have in this PI, we may be able to, it would be good to spend it on a demo enhancements and making sure an end-to-end demo works. We already have end-to-end tests that work. We have a demo on Moduloop YouTube on that. So feel free to look at the PDF deck uploaded to GitHub and find the links there. There's also, I think, a requirement for a third-party dev portal or sandbox that's been talked about. At this stage, unless there are any additional features provided on top of existing Moduloop, even any Moduloop deployment that deploys default Moduloop with third-party services enabled should be able to provide the APIs and the services needed. It's just that we may need, in some cases, to provide dev portals or user interface to help with hackathons or more advanced use cases. So these are things. Mostly, we need a good demo to build on what was done so far and support hackathons. The other two connectors are more for ensuring that the third-party functionality implemented works in real world. Michael and JJ have many of the use cases. I think talked about alternate mechanisms of authorizations, potentially bulk, but I think these are still in consideration. I think Matt Miller, JJ, and Michael mentioned yesterday that those need further discussions. So we'll continue that. But I think these are things we can do in the coming few weeks. Thanks, Paul.
Perfect. Thank you, Sam. That was great. The next one on my list was foreign exchange. So I'm going to hand over to Michael and ask him to tout the foreign exchange workstream.
Sad to say, I forgot to don my ticket touts kit for today, but you will have to take me as I am, I'm afraid. Currency conversion in Moduloop systems. So we talked about it earlier. What do we want to do? Well, first of all, we want support for bulk and payment versus payment currency purchases in Moduloop. Bulk, people can buy as much as they want of a particular foreign currency, DFSPs, I mean, not people. Payment versus payment is the per transfer, low cost support for currency conversion as part of a transfer. We want to implement this via direct interactions between DFSPs and foreign exchange providers, possibly multiple foreign exchange providers in a single Moduloop scheme. And we also want, for this purpose in particular, but probably also in general, to be able to get deterministic outcomes for multi-component transactions. That is to say, if a transfer includes a foreign exchange conversion, either both the conversion and the transfer should succeed, or both of them should fail. but it should not be possible for one of the components to succeed and the other one to fail. So that's really our objectives. What do we need to do in order to reach those objectives? Well, first of all, we need to implement the API changes. They've been defined, they've been reviewed, they are more or less ready to go. If anyone wants to look at the document and comment on it, they will be most welcome to do so. It's available on our GitHub page, or you can contact me directly and ask for a copy, and I'd be very happy to send it to you, and also to go through the thinking behind it if anyone is interested. We need to add service discovery for foreign exchange providers. Now, that's something which we have added as an endpoint as part of the PISP, third-party interface, but we need to extend it so that DFSPs can ask the switch what institutions are offering currency conversion in their switch. We need to add some handlers for the new foreign exchange transfers, the new currency conversion transfers. We'll need a quotes handler, we'll need a prepare handler, and we'll need a commit or fulfill handler for those, because we have different endpoints for currency conversion. Those handlers, they will be essentially analogous to the handlers we already have for transfers, but nevertheless, we will need to construct them and add them to the switch code. And we will also need to add dependency checking to the commit handlers for transfers and for foreign exchange transfers. Pardon me. And we'll need to add, obviously, tests and testing toolkit support so that we can simulate these things happening correctly. So those are the things that we need to do. The resources we need are a services endpoint, as I've already said, an FX version of the quotes endpoint, and an FX version of the transfers endpoint. So 3 new sets of endpoints for the FX, for the foreign exchange API. There will be some changes we want to the FSP IOP API. They are changes that we think will be non-breaking because they will all be optional. To first of all, to be able to receive a list of currencies in which a payee's account can receive by an addition to the put parties call in the FSP IOP API. To change the data model for post quotes and put quotes to allow the debtor DFSP to specify that it wants the creditor DFSP to undertake currency conversion or vice versa. And the transaction object should be extended to include that information as part of the agreed terms of the transfer. This is a brief schematic of how we think, well, sorry, I'll rephrase that, how I think the dependency check might work. I will obviously be sending a copy of or putting a copy of this presentation so people who want to check it and take a look and comment on it can do so. But essentially it says the confirmation is in 2 parts. The foreign exchange transfer, if it succeeds, is added to a watch queue for the transfer itself, and that waits for the transfer fulfill event, which happens below that line. Then if that, if there is an associated transfer for the transfer part of it, then we will either succeed or fail the foreign exchange conversion. So that ensures that either both of the parts of the transfer will succeed or both parts will fail. So that's a little bit of work on part of that. So apart from that, does anyone have any questions?
I might ask, what is the best way of beginning the collaboration on this? So is it through some form of work, as we've talked about, a work stream meeting? Talk about
Yes.
this, is that the best way, or
Yep.
just yeah, okay, fine.
Yep, I think a work stream meeting.
Yeah.
If I could jump in too quickly,
Sure.
this is a pretty complex subject. I was
Yeah.
able to follow your presentation, and it looks like there's a opportunity in a couple of places to think about the cryptographic interlocks, as well as the other forms of guarantees that are unique to Mojaloop, but also to think about what happens if we go down this path with Interledger, which looks pretty promising. What implications does that have? Those are more for outlining the areas of the problem over time, but then picking off what can we do straight ahead that doesn't forestall us doing those things, but that gets quick progress on the core of the FX. Because it seems like this is a pretty big problem. There's a lot of work that needs doing, but taking the minimum viable product approach, we could get something narrowly through this relatively quickly to demonstrate the core concepts. But if we did this without demonstrating the core parts, that is the cryptographic interlocks or the ability to do the proper quotation cycle, I don't know that we've really proved much at that point. So it's unfortunately kind of a big first step. So I agree that I think a workshop format for this would be good, starting with really walking through the design at present, not to so much to debate it as to factor it into parts that can be worked on. There's always opportunity to look at those things that don't feel like they fit well and revisit. But I think that getting everyone else's head in this at the same level that yours is would be super helpful.
Sure.
And I'm sorry, but I don't have any solution for the time zone problem other than to ask one of us, either in Adelaide or in Seattle, to go somewhere else during the workshop.
We can wait for continental drift, I think, to move.
Yeah, I'll volunteer to go to
Adelaide.
or indeed Seattle.
I was going to make a recommendation, however, was that we be prepared to do some serious work on the ground in Zanzibar, where we will all be together.
Yeah,
and
Yes.
that does unfortunately mean some time zone gymnastics to get that first workshop together, where we can really seriously walk through the design and try to take a crack at factoring. I don't know, Michael, how you react to that.
No, that sounds like a great idea. One comment I'd like to make on the idea of how this might play into our interest in cross-network providers is that this model does, as it were, out of the box, support a situation where a DFSP receives a request for a transfer in, as it were, any currency whatsoever, because we're now allowing the DFSP, the payee DFSP, to obtain currency conversion cover for a transfer, at least in principle, in whatever currency it comes in. That should be able just to happen without the necessity for the sending party on the other side of the cross-network provider to manage currency conversion for themselves. And I think, as we've said, I think several times before, it's more likely that currency conversion to a relatively underused currency will be available at reasonable cost in the target jurisdiction than it is that it will be available at reasonable cost in the source jurisdiction. So if you're talking about converting, let's say, to Rwandan francs or other small currencies, when I say small currencies, you understand, I'm not intending to disparage them in any way, relative to the US dollar. Exactly. It's more likely that you'll be able to get those conversions at reasonable cost in Rwanda than it is that you will be able to get them at a reasonable cost in Seattle, let's say.
Quite. Yes. Okay, well, anything else, Michael, you wanted to add to that?
Nothing else from me, apart from to say, yes, let me take as an action then to try and set up a workshop or a work stream meeting to kick this process off, and as Miller says, start the process of analysing and factoring what we intend to do.
Okay, I'll work with you on that, Michael, because I need to make sure that it's sort of in some form of alignment with the other work stream.
Sure.
Okay, cool. Thank you. The next item on my list was infrastructure, and we had Tom and David Fry talking yesterday. I would ask one or both of them to present serially or in parallel. perhaps I can hand it over to Tom to begin with.
Sure. I don't have too much to add, just to give a little bit of context back, or a little bit more context than perhaps I was able to do yesterday. And we're going to try this. We're going to try sharing the screen again, and hopefully we can get my slides up. Let me see how we go here. I'm hoping you can see the 4 columns.
Yep.
So again, just to recap, this work stream was sort of announced in Arusha, and then we did what we're going to do today. I guess we voted on the work streams, and then we did a huddle for an hour, and then I took the action item to try and take a swag, a first cut at what I was hearing, and that's what you're looking at in this slide deck. And there's a little bit more to it, and there's a couple of other important things that I'll just mention. But I've also, spent 3 months thinking about this and talking to people as well, and I think the very first thing that we could conclude is that we don't need, well, sorry, let's go back one step. What are we trying to achieve? I actually think that we're trying to achieve 2 or 3 things. One is that we are, per the left-hand column, we're trying to actually make it very, very easy for people who don't have a lot of expertise with cloud native applications, Kubernetes, containers, to actually try out and get some context what Mojaloop actually offers them. And so having something you can get up in a half an hour, and then you point the testing toolkit to it, you point the VJ's mobile simulators, and you watch phones actually transfer money from one to another, get a quote, and actually have the balance actually, have the funds turn from one phone to the other. So it's really, it's access. Level 1 is all about access, and if you like, marketing and demo. Level 4, as we have it here, and I'm going to propose that we don't need 4 levels anymore, but level 4 is trying to achieve the, how do we make somebody who's actually implementing this in anger, who's committed to it, how do we make them really, really productive? And I won't say too much about that because I'll leave that to David. Obviously, this is his baby. When we were talking in between, in Arusha and in between, we also had this second and third levels, somewhat, I think, driven by discussions around the Rwandan sandbox, and some of the comments that David made, and some comments that Michael made in subsequent meetings. Can we, and sorry, there's one other little bit of history for people that I think is really informing even the nomenclature here. I think the nomenclature of sandbox is actually coming from what Lewis did with the OSS sandbox in Amazon, making a pre-deployed environment available, and of course the Rwandan sandbox as well for testing things, and I guess the Bits2Works project and a couple of others. So I think our first goal is to actually talk about what the goals are. I've outlined level 1 and the demo and the production. I think that's a given. The questions I think we need to ask are, do we need the things in level 2 and level 3? And if so, do we need a separate sandbox toolkit, or should they be part of the IAC or part of Miniloop? or should they be something separate again? Because as you're going from left to right here, you're also talking about a lot more resources, as well as a lot more understanding, and therefore a lot more cost and a lot more moving parts. So I think for the next 3 months, this is just my opinion, and I'll hand it over to David in a minute. I think we need to do a couple of things. I think we need to actually talk about and get a really concrete agreement on the purposes of the things and the list of things that should be in level 2 or 3. And then we need to figure out whether level 2 and 3 need to go away or whether they just need to coalesce. And then if they don't go away, how do they get implemented and who owns them and how can they be built? I think that's really the job. So I don't know if you're there, David, and you want to say a few things, or is that? No, not hearing anything. So
sorry, I'm just talking to mute.
You're talking to you. All right, David.
So I think it's a good framing. I have some nitpicking that I would do with the categorization. And basically the first thing is, I think level 4 in your diagram, while good for kind of filling out the whole list of goals or purposes for infrastructure, I think we should remove it from our further discussions, because even the IEC that has been developed, we're explicitly saying that it's not production ready, right? It might form the basis of somebody of code that somebody would use to go to production, but we're on purpose saying that all we're doing is up to level 3. So while this diagram here on the screen is good for full discussion, I think in our work stream, we're going to leave level 4 out of the picture, and we're just going to discuss levels 1, 2, and 3. And then my second comment would be, in terms of the level 2 and level 3, I think we do need to have some further group discussion about what are we actually trying to achieve with level 2. The level 2 seems to me to be like a hackathon type of purpose. And level 3, I think, is what the IEC that you've mentioned before, that it's my baby, or, it's not my baby, but it's definitely something I put a lot of time into and needs more community involvement to flesh out. That is for, running a countrywide POC, and that is the end of the spectrum. Right. So I think that part is pretty well defined, and it needs to have community development effort put into it in order to fully flesh it out, no doubt. And then the one that I think we really need to talk about is, what are we trying to do with hackathon type environments? What pieces go into it? What are the requirements for that? I think that's the biggest question mark in my mind that requires more definition.
Yeah, cool. Thanks. No argument. That's great. That's actually moving on. I think you're clarifying what I said. We need to actually figure out what it is that we're trying to achieve, and then which ones. I think you've simplified things already there, David, by saying, well, we probably don't need level 4. So okay, that's great. But I hope everybody else listening is actually getting the idea that what we're trying to do is to facilitate using the technology that we're building. So infrastructure is just about enabling the users and the use case at whatever level that people are actually at. So we've got all the conversations about the code. We've got all the conversations about the application and payments and the problem space. This topic is how to make that most conveniently and most accessible to the most people for the right level. and I'll leave it there. Hopefully that's clear, and hopefully that's indicating the importance of what we're trying to do here.
I've got a couple of comments that I think might help us resolve a thread through this. I see really two different uses here, although we have 3 levels that we're looking at. There really are 4, but there's really 2 that I think we could focus on. One has the focus of getting somebody from nothing to running as fast as possible, which is really the level 1 combination of level 1 and level 2, depending on who you are, if you're an account holding institution or a developer or a fintech. But theoretically, it's, I just need to get started. How do I get this thing up and running so that I can start testing on my own system and doing small amounts of development integration? But then there's a step beyond that, which is really not so much about infrastructure as code as it is about continuous integration and continuous deployment. That's the thing that's getting us in trouble. We're not actually, and Tom, I know this is a thing that you've been harping on as well. We're not really using Kubernetes the way it was intended. That if we go through a process with integration to an operating environment, I'm speaking now for example, like they're developing one in Rwanda, the Myanmar situation, and some of the others, that they need the ability to take current code, spin the system up in their sandbox environment and get running with it quickly, and not to be treating some of the inputs quite as precious as we do now. There has to be a way to stay on the tip that's relatively easy to do. And I know IAC is the key to making that work, but I don't really think it's quite to that point yet. It still feels like you climb a mountain, and when you get there, you plant a flag and you wait, and you really aren't that eager to climb the mountain again. It would be way better to get to a point where it's a steady state of choices made around what to integrate, but that there's a steady cadence of upgrading to latest stuff, and that IAC enables that. Miniloop is a different version of that, which is that I can start from nothing and get something running, and I can do that so easily that there's really no point in modifying what I have. I just start over. I can just spin up whatever new thing I need. I'm going to work a patch on something. I can spin it up and test it. I can tear it down. Then I can spin up the next thing, get back on tip and do some work there. It does seem like those are combination of use of the Kubernetes environment in different ways. I mean, I tend to agree that the full production isn't so much a thing that we can deliver, but we could certainly deliver templates or ideas about how one integrates into that environment that builds on the cadence approach to the sandbox, which I guess would be a combination of level 2 and 3. That's some initial thoughts. It seems like we need to really think about what we're delivering out the end, and so we know that we've achieved that.
Yeah, thanks, Miller. I think, a couple of comments about the production and the level 3, the sandbox, the Myanmar experience, for instance. And we have obviously FitzelWorks here who can talk about that experience from their own point of view. I think the main reason for leaving production out is because we're not making any production guarantees, right? If somebody's going to use this, they have to ensure that it fits their production needs, which are going to be case by case, specific to that implementation. So the level 3, the POC, I believe, does provide a lot of suggestions on how to move forward, but it doesn't provide all the suggestions, right? So we do approximate what you're describing in terms of giving some suggestions about how they would secure a production environment, but we're not saying that this is a production environment, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, but that's the point I'm trying to make, is that you can't hand this off, a Miniloop or a level 2 sandbox, to generate a POC and then say, okay, now you just have to take it to production, because the gap is too great.
Yeah.
And so some guidance in thinking about how do you build a production CI/CD pipeline, including a pre-production sandbox and a conversion strategy that allows you to flip into production. How does that work? We demonstrated that years ago when we actually started using Kubernetes, that we could shoot a server and it would come back up again. We show how self-healing works. and we could show how zero downtime upgrades work. We can't do that today. We need to demonstrate that, exactly demonstrate this is exactly how it works. And then
I
someone can
agree.
say, okay, now I need to put my own stuff in that. But there isn't any guidance in place for doing that. And there's no baseline to start from. That's where I think we're looking at for level 4. Perhaps I'm not saying something different than you are, but
Yeah.
the focus perhaps is different.
Yeah, and we did some effort around that, but I think I totally agree that needs to be more work needs to go into it. And it has to be a little bit better documented. But obviously, it's not mini loop to production. We're talking about actual multi-node clusters, and the way that you would react to failure scenarios is somewhat dependent on the type of deployment that you have. So it's not one size fits all, but I would love to see more effort put into that space to give more Mojo Loop recommendations on how production would actually be deployed. But just to be clear, right now with the work that's gone into the IAC and what's been deployed in AWS for the Myanmar project, allows you to quickly deploy a switch. And if you're, like you were saying, in a development environment that you just want to destroy it and bring it back up with the newest versions, that's a pretty easy thing to accomplish right now. And I also, with the use of payment managers on the periphery, that isolates the DFSPs from the actual switch having changes or what have you. So there's a lot of things that we can talk about with the current version of IAC that will allow us to address a lot of the things that you mentioned. But before we finish here, the level 2, the hackathon, or I'm calling it the hackathon environment. We have to decide in these discussions that come up in the work stream, do we really need a switch? And for instance, could we use the TTK in order to support all the use cases? Because I think that the real distinction between 2 and 3 is that 2, we don't have any DFSPs. We have fintechs that are participating. That's the audience that's described there. Whereas the account holding institutions is the level in the level 3. There we're actually needing to have a switch in order to be useful as a demo environment. So I think that's the distinction. And if we look at 2, we want to come up with solutions that allow us to react to needing a hackathon environment quickly. And if we can not use a switch, I think, and we have a very lightweight solution that will support the use cases for hackathons and the other envisioned purposes for level 2, then I think we have a better arrow to use in those types of use cases.
Yeah, the level 2 using the TTK is a very good idea, and being able to have that environment, that means that when you run a hackathon, you can make the decision. You either want to switch or you don't. So it's not that level 2 is for fintechs and level 3 is for account holding institutions. It's that there is a TTK based environment that can support a large part of tire kicking and hackathon style work. And how you do that would be what you're calling level 2. It's a set of practices and documentation around the use of the TTK to fully simulate a switch environment. It needs to support PISP as well as the standard interfaces. Then the level 3 environment is where you really do have a running switch in a sandbox to support something that's beyond what could be supported by the TTK. So those two things are complementary. I agree with you that we might want to focus level 2 on just the simulation environment and not on the use of the full thing, because there's not a lot of difference otherwise between 2 and 3 if they're both using switches.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of security implications with level 3 because you do have account holding institutions that are connecting their environments to it, and so I think that is the complexity that level 3 brings that you don't have to worry about really in level 2.
No, that makes sense. And of course, the point being that 1, 2, 3 all look like relatively modest hardware commitments. 1 and 2 being like largely local, possibly server, but 3 being cloud, but it's a very small footprint. And 4 is unknown because it's production and you have no idea what's going to really need to be assembled. So it does seem like there's a set of work that ought to be specified, but it really ought to be pulled through a set of outcomes that we're seeking, and not so much where are we now and how could we make it better, but really look at those outcomes. So specify specifically, if you are done with level 2, what could you do? What would the TTK environment, the simulation environment, allow you to do, and demonstrate that you can do those things. Likewise, in level 3, what can I do in a simple cloud environment? Very much like I would have had in level 1, but now in a cloud environment and with appropriate security connection points for actual account holding institutions in a non-production environment with fake customers. Once we've got those fairly complementary outcomes defined, we've got a lot of resources already built that I think the gap will be clear. So what needs to be closed?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was saying. We want to define what it is that we want to use these things for. But I thought it's worth mentioning Tenexio in Mojaloop Help, and then I'm sure David's had conversations with him as I have. And I think it's a gentleman from France. I was on a Zoom session with him, and he went from using Miniloop, and we got him up and running, and he's all happy, and that was great. And then 2 weeks, and he went quiet, and I went, oh, okay, fine. He either lost interest or whatever. Then the next post I see is he's actually running IAC, and he's actually trying to get the whole shebang up and running. And I thought, well, there is exactly one scenario of what we want to do, is we want to take somebody from kicking the tires through to, okay, I need more expertise, and now I need some different outcomes, and I need something that's much more real world. I thought that, you know, maybe we could put our outcomes just as a set of scenarios, whether they're hackathons, whether they're ways that a government will actually progress through doing a countrywide switch or whatever. And I thought that might inform what we actually want in terms of the sandboxes.
Yeah, I'm working with Najee, who's the Tunixio, who's behind Tunixio, and
yeah,
he and we just got GitLab running on the latest Bootstrap, and what I mentioned yesterday about polishing up and doing some releases has been driven quite a bit from his needs. So we're just getting the switch running on his AWS account. So I think, and what I mentioned about getting documentation polished, I was referring to this effort. So I think I totally agree. I think it would be a great not a use case, but an example of that trajectory that you're talking about, from Miniloop to actually getting a switch up and running.
Yeah. So I guess we're actually for the last 10 minutes, we've been doing what the work stream job is.
Yes.
To actually define what but
Yes.
Anyway, hopefully that gives everybody a good feel for what we've got to do and the unit of work in front of us.
I think that's the point. It's not to do all of the work, but to do enough here that we've got some clear idea of what the work stream's for. And I think that redefining these Miniloop, ML Sandbox Medium, so redefining those labels so that we have a clear outcome that we're looking for, that's a huge step forward.
So can we bring this to an end for now, please? Thank you. It's been an extremely useful and interesting discussion. But Tom, as you said, we should really focus on the work stream session afterwards, hoping that people will vote for infrastructure, because I think it's clear that it would benefit from significant community input. So thank you very much. The next one is settlement models. So I'm going to pass over to Michael now to talk about settlement models.
Thank you very much.
And stopping
Hold
talking
on.
about PISPs on the chat. Thank you.
Why do you want to stop me talking about PISPs?
Try and do both at once. Come on.
Yeah, and why not? Right. Okay. So settlement version 2. We didn't talk about that in the presentations this convening, but we did mention it several times. So what do we want to do? Well, we want to extend the existing settlement model so that we can define the types of transfer which are settled according to the model. Transfers like this are settled by this model, so that we can split out different kinds of transfers and say this settlement model settles these kinds of transfers. We also want to be able to define how the transfers which are settled by the model are deterministically assigned to settlement batches by time period or by other characteristics of the transfer. And we've had a number of problems, as I think as most people know, in the past, because at present it's not possible to accurately assign transfers to a particular settlement window. And that's caused all kinds of problems, reconciliation and settlement problems for participants. Second, we want to be able to record ledger movements according to the ledger defined in the settlement model. So what we want to be able to do is not only to say types of transfer are settled like this, but also to have different ledgers for those different settlement models, and that includes both position ledgers and settled funds ledgers. So that means that, for instance, the liquidity check will be a liquidity check against the settlement account, which is defined for that settlement model. So we will be able, for instance, to do things like where we are doing very large batch transfers, we can hypothecate settlement for that, or settlement liquidity cover for that transfer, so that we get round the potential problem we have at the moment, that where we're trying to do a very large transfer, it's possible that some of the transfers might not succeed because liquidity cover isn't available. So that's an example of the sorts of things that we might be able to do. Then we want to be able to settle by settlement batches, i.e. deterministically assigned batches, not settlement windows. So that is a rough statement of what I think we want to be able to do. So in order to do that, what do we need to change? Well, first of all, we need to extend the settlement model from where it currently is. We need to extend the definition and the way it's stored and persisted in the database. We need to change the admin API to accommodate the new structures, and we will need to change the business operations framework eventually to support the new functions, though those second two would not be necessary, I think, for an MVP for Settlement v2. We also need to create ledgers dynamically when settlement models are saved, because one of the implications of this is that if I were to define a new settlement model while a scheme is running, I would want to be able to generate the ledgers appropriate to that settlement model for each participant in the scheme without having to stop the thing. I just want them to turn up so that they can be used. At the moment, I think, as people generally know, ledgers are set up for participants when the scheme is set up. So this is something that will have to be much more dynamic than that. Second, we want to be able to assign a transfer to a ledger. At the moment, ledger assignment is fixed in the switch. There's just a single ledger to which transfers are assigned and against which settlement funds are measured. That will need to become variable. It will need to be we need to be assigned for each transfer as it comes in. That doesn't necessarily need, well, we would hope, to be a difficult or time-consuming process, but it will need to be variable. Now, or second or third rather, we'll need to assign a transfer to a batch. And that means we need to replace the existing assignment code in the switch. Now, all it does in the switch at the moment is it just says, assign this transfer to the current settlement window. We will need to change that so that for any given transfer, we apply the batch definition rule for that type of transfer, and then store the information relating to that transfer in that particular batch. And that will give us deterministic assignment of transfers to batches. We also therefore need to be able to create settlement batches dynamically. Depending on how those things are set up, we will need the ability to create new settlement batches ad hoc as we go along, and that will need to happen automatically. We also need, I think, still to support manual closure of a batch. So in a case where, for instance, there is a problem, it should be possible to close a batch to which that transfer or those transfers belong, and to continue storing other transfers in a different batch, just so that we can make sure that we minimize the number of transfers that have to be held up from settlement due to some known problem. So we think the simple thing there is that a batch is manually closed by renaming it. We will need, I think, to change the admin API and the business operations framework to enable administrators to see which batch is available and to close it manually. We will then need to modify the settlement process itself to allow settlement contents to be selected by batch, and also to allow renaming in the same way as for manual closure, because one of the things about this deterministic assignment of transfers to windows is the thing that you lose as a consequence of that is the ability to say, I will only settle a window if it has already been closed, and therefore no further transfers can be assigned to it. The downside of a deterministic assignment of transfers to batches is that it will be, you will need to have some way of saying what happens if for some reason a transfer turns up late which should have gone into a batch which is in fact already being settled. Shouldn't happen, I know, but again we need to have confidence that no transfers can be lost as part of that process. So this is really, I want to talk a little bit about the processes by which we get from the code that actually does the assignment of transfers to particular settlement models and transfers to batches to where we eventually want to be on this. So at the first level, we have the executable code itself, which we expect to be a procedure with a standard name, which just gets called from as part of the preparation stage and as part of the fulfillment stage. Second, we want stored definitions, i.e. some way of storing the definition of how to assign a transfer to a settlement model. And those stored definitions will produce executable code via a deterministic process. Third, there'll be a user interface which will enable an administrator to create and modify stored definitions which will result in executable code, changes to the executable code. Now, ease of definition, it's easiest at the user interface. The idea is that the user interface ought to be something that any administrator who understands the concepts behind the system could manipulate. The hardest, of course, is to make direct changes to the executable code, which you would need to be a developer in order to do. However, we don't expect this to be something that would change very often. So it may be that for simplicity's sake, we would just, at least in the first instance, set up the executable code. And as long as we set it up in a standard way, it should be possible later on to add the other layers that will produce it. On the other hand, simplicity of implementation is easiest if you only have to worry about the executable code. It gets progressively more complex and difficult as you have to define what the stored definitions would look like and design the user interface to enable those stored definitions to be set up by non-technical users. So that's just we need to think about this sort of slide. But I'm expecting that for an MVP of Settlement v2, we only need to do step one, i.e. produce executable code, and as long as it's in a standard form, that should be fine. We can add to it later. So that's all I have to say, except that for the later use of Moduloop and for wider adoption, we have to fix this, I think. I mean, we're coming up again and again against problems which are generated by the fact that the settlement model we currently use is not fit for purpose. We really need to do something about this, and we need to do something about it fast, if only because the work that we're currently doing, which we talked about yesterday, for instance, on remittances from outside the system, we will definitely need to be able to manage those transfers in a different way, to manage and settle them in a different way from the way we do transfers generated inside the system. Nia, I can see you have your hand up. Would you like to ask me a question?
Thank you, Michael. Yes, I do. This is very exciting, right? As you can imagine from our team. We're all watching how this could be applicable, right, to what we are doing, not only for WinePay but also for the other POC that we're working together. As you can imagine, Michael. One question that I wanted to clarify, right? The settlement type. Using a settlement model specifically tied to this type, it's very clear. I also wanted to raise the need that we had, not currently now, but I think in the future we may have multiple settlement banks using the same model, right? So we have the same settlement type using the same settlement model, but going to settlement different settlement banks. In this design, in this model that you're thinking, are you also planning for that eventual need in a particular installation?
Well, it's certainly the case that we would expect. Sorry, I want to go directly to your question, which is about different settlement banks, but the same settlement model. Now, it's certainly the case at the moment that we could support different settlement banks via the same settlement model, because the definition and the creation of the instructions to those banks to execute a settlement is not part of the core system itself, and that was deliberate on our part. We've talked about it a number of times in the past and said it would be too complicated to provide a generalized way of doing this. Now, I suspect for a number of reasons that, as you imply, we will need to think about ways in which we might bring that further into the Moduloop product itself, so that we can do much more about providing support for people to do configuration of actual settlement instructions as part of the central product itself. However, I deliberately excluded that from consideration in this because what I want to say is this is urgent stuff. We need to do it now. Does that answer your question?
Yes, Michael, thank you.
Okay.
Yep.
Miller, you have your hand up. It's very exciting, all this hand up stuff, isn't it?
Oh, just why not? So I think fundamentally what we're looking at is that the settlement process, however it's modeled, starts with a pool of liquidity that can be used to collateralize transfers. And the assignment of a particular transfer to a particular pool of liquidity is a combination of configuration choice in the scheme, which is very slow moving, and the admission of participants to those various collateral pools, and the characteristics of the transfer that's being brought in. So if we lay aside FX for a moment because it's complicated, and look at the simple transfers, we have at least two different kinds of things we have to deal with that flow from the transfer itself. One of them is settling a principal between the two institutions. And if they don't both join the same collateral pool, then the transfer cannot be cleared. It's very simple. In that case, you either find a pool that they're both members of and that meets the configuration choices for the scheme, or you have to reject the transfer. In the case where you have offline things like interchange fees that are being handled by the scheme that are also off transaction but driven by transactions, there's a set of configuration around how that's collateralized. In the case, it's probably generally collateralized by credit. You send out bills, but you don't expect those to be collateralized directly in real time with real money. So then it starts to get hard when you get beyond that and you talk about FX and the things you started to raise this week.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, though, I don't see any functional difference between batches and windows, except that batches aren't as flexible. When we talk about windows, we can say that it is a window into a collateral pool. When you show up to clear a transfer, you find a window onto the collateral pool to which both of them are configured to use. Both of the facilitating institutions are joined to and are configured to use. And there could be more than one. So you do have to have rules for how you select that. But once you've done that, that window stays open for whatever the settlement period for that collateral pool is. So if you have two different settlement banks, you have two different collateral pools. That's already more complicated than you'd like, but at least if there's a reason for it, you have that. And you have one window open on each one. You have to decide which window you're going to join, and there can be a set of configuration and rules around that. When you start getting into batches, all you're doing is you're throwing stuff into a batch, and then you have to decide later how you're going to reassign those to actual settlement practice. By doing it up front using windows, you've made that assumption up front. You've essentially assigned the transfers as a condition of accepting for clearing into an open settlement window that allows you to then process them automatically later and disconnectedly. It's important that we recognize that settlement runs on its own cadence, independent of the clearing process itself. And I know that FX, this gets complicated because of the spot rate changes during the day that Mwali has pointed out to us. And so some modeling does have to go on there. But I think fundamentally we have to get back to what is it we're actually doing. We're collateralizing the real-time clearing of transfers, which means that collateral pool has to be joined by both parties. And there has to be an ability for it to run independently once the transaction is cleared.
Yep.
And so, and that means that there's very little variability between the point at which you admit the transfer into the system and the point at which you commit it. You could say, I'm going to do nothing until I commit. I'm just going to make the assumption that this is available, look at the positions, but those positions are held on each liquidity pool separately. So if I have two different liquidity pools, two different settlement banks, then I have two different positions that I have to manage. And so all of that should be looked at through that lens of efficiency, but also within the core design principles for the separation of settlement from clearing. So I think workshopping first that notion that the models are in service of this other goal, not the thing. Then how do we accomplish these different use cases? How can these different use cases be supported by at least the most cohesive settlement collection of settlement models that we have? I'm not sure we're quite ready to get to code versus declarative design. To me, what we had for ALS, for example, was quite good. It said, we don't know how those ID systems work. We know what we need from them. And so we define that and we allow you to write custom code with no configuration layer in between for the individual ID systems. We're not trying to anticipate what they all look like. We're saying here's what we need from them. We can do a similar thing here and probably move quite quickly. And then later stages, perhaps you'll find some declarative overlay that simplifies, but I suspect that's just complication right now. So getting back to basics, looking at what the actual settlement practices is, and then from that coming forward to a gap analysis of where we are, where we need to be.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you should be able to move quite quickly with a work stream environment with that kind of structure on it. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you. I should say that this model came out of workshopping with Mwali in particular, who set up a number of who originated a number of the requirements this is intended to answer. But that's not, of course, to say that that it wouldn't be valuable to workshop again with different participants and make sure that we really are achieving wide enough coverage. One comment that I would like to make about windows and batches is that I don't think from a settlement point of view there is any difference, as you rightly say. A window onto a collateral pool and a batch that looks at components of a collateral pool, in my mind at least, come to the same thing. From the liquidity cover point of view, at least, and we're always saying that no matter which batch or which window we assign a transfer to, it will always be a portion of the overall collateral pool, and we have made sure that it won't be possible for that collateral to be used twice in different batches or different windows. Now, I mean, I think it's not the time now to go into the reasons why we went for a batch rather than window view, but I'd be happy to pick that up again in the workshop. I'm conscious also of the fact that poor Pedro has had his hand up for so long, his arm must be tired. Pedro.
Also, we have already run out of time. We've only done 4 models, so 4 work streams. So please, Pedro, can we keep this short? I can't hear you, Pedro.
You're muted for, well, so actually you're not muted, but we can't hear you.
Not music.
That's
better.
Yeah,
Oh,
we
yeah.
can hear you now.
Sorry. Too many microphones connected at the system. Well, first, good presentation, Michael. And first point is regarding the ability to have multiple models that need configuration. I know we discussed this plenty of times during the reference architecture meetings, but it's a good time to pass this point to the community. This is a very good example for vNext platform configuration mechanism that will allow operators to configure the functionality without changing the code or doing redeployments. And this will allow them also to do these changes in a secure, authorized mechanism that is also audited. So basically, this will allow them to change system parameters, change the way the system works in a secure and audited fashion. This is an important mechanism for big systems like ours. The second point is, I'm going to repeat myself. This is the usual question about, are these new developments and new features something that we have to do right now, or can we plan this for vNext and benefit from all of the benefits that vNext will bring in terms of authorization, security, and platform configuration, for example, and also its architecture and the way it interconnects. And again, I'll probably ask these questions through all of the work streams, because I do think that we now have this reference architecture that allows us to frame these product development decisions in this fashion. Is it a tactical decision, i.e. must we really develop this right now for valid reasons, or in the case that we don't have to develop this right now, can we slot this for the future vNext release and make a strategic decision, making sure that we will have this once we get to the vNext, and also shift the resources to making sure that vNext has resources. So yeah, that was my quick comment. Apologies, I'm going to be repeating myself.
So I'm going to respond and say, I think we need to move quickly on this. I mean, I really do, because it underpins so many of the other things that we want to be able to do, and in particular the sorts of things where we are dealing with remittances as well as internal transactions. However, I would hope, and it's something I've said before, I would hope that we would be able to do this, and indeed the architectural plan is that we should be able to do this in a way that will more or less be vNext-ish. So it's certainly the case that we will be looking as hard as we can at the vNext designs to make sure that whatever we would implement here is something that can be slotted in, hopefully without modification, into the vNext architecture.
Well, you know my thinking about that. The problem, this is a chicken and egg issue, right? Which is, if this is done like this, the decisions that were made today are going to limit the freedom that we have in vNext. So anyway, I just want to put out this question. We should always be asking this question. Is this something that we must do right now, or can we wait a bit and do this for the next version of the platform?
So my answer is no, we need to move now, I think. If on the other hand, if you were to say to me, yeah, but vNext is going to be loaded and ready to go by, let's say, Q4 of this year, then I would say, cool. In that case, vNext is my man.
No, that's a fair point. The question is always about resources, right? Because if we do everything now, we will never have resources to deliver in that wish that you have. So if we had enough resources, vNext would be next quarter, but we don't.
I know.
So it's a blanket. It's a blanket.
Yes, indeed.
Anyway,
one of the many things that saddens my life, Pedro, that we can't get vNext quickly enough.
Always a gentleman.
However, for the moment, I'm going to stop sharing and give the stage back to Paul.
Michael, thank you for that. Very enlightening as ever. The next piece was a digital identity integration. I'm going to keep this short because we're already massively over time here, for which I won't apologize. I'll blame everyone else. So digital identity integration. This is all about the emerging or clearly anticipatable need to be able to start addressing payments using a national identity service registration of some form, a national identity number. It is already live in a number of markets. Obviously, we're thinking India and Nigeria. You can do this. Well, Nigeria, they use the BVN rather than the NIMSI, but you take my point. We need to be able to support it. It's not that big a change within Mojaloop itself, because of the architecture around ALS and the link to multiple oracles. We can support this, but there is work that is needed. So first of all, why do we need it? Well, it's all about the ability to support some of the World Bank initiatives around G2P and salary runs and all these other things. There was this huge thing in Nigeria, for example, where when they moved to identity-based payments, a significant number, I believe it was of the order of about 10,000 ghost employees disappeared from the civil service, for example. So we should be able to support this kind of function. It's not about what you'd expect from a national identity service in terms of the ability to assert an identity, the ability to authenticate that the person who is asserting the identity is the legitimate person, the person who has that identity. All of that is out of scope. What we're interested in is the ability of a sender to address a payment to a national identity number. There needs to be work done around an interface definition. Interface to what? Well, the obvious one that we want to start to work with is MOSIP. Open source, potentially usable for national identity services. It's a good starting point. I'm not suggesting it's the only point, but we need to start working with the MOSIP teams on providing an interface where we can take a national identity number and look it up within their service to check that it is valid, a real identity. We do need to have some form of mechanism to attach that to an FSP ID in some way, to be able to translate. In other words, create an oracle which translates between a national identity number and an FSP ID. That is something that I prefer MOSIP to do, but MOSIP is about identity. They're not about payments at all. They don't care about FSPs in any case. Therefore, I can well imagine that we are going to have to develop that particular Oracle. We're then going to have to perhaps adapt the double tap approach that we developed in Myanmar for WinePay to allow us to take that national identity, resolve it to an FSP ID, and then resolve it back to an account ID. All of that is eminently achievable. We're not talking about a big piece of work here, but it is going to get very urgent very quickly, I think. Certainly in our discussions that we're having at the moment with the World Bank and through them with MOSIP and OpenG2P, this is going to become a requirement quite soon. I would urge you to support it, to provide assistance wherever you can. I'm not the person to come up with the technical design of this. I'm more focused on what the product needs to support. So hopefully we could do some work on this over the next couple of months. So thank you. Having said, Miller, please. Miller.
There we go. Got 3 different mute buttons. Sorry, Paul. Before you go on, I just want to be clear that I think that the engagement with MOSIP is very useful, and we should look at that, not necessarily assume that they won't do the association work that we would need, but to talk it through with them. And if they say there really just isn't a structure for that in MOSIP that is manageable, that's fine. What we've said and what we've done in TIPS and in other places is that the ALS is the way in which we handle this association. And there are a couple of things that are important that fall out of that design, and they're actually fundamental to the way Mojaloop works. So we've been very careful to maintain those as structural concerns about whatever we choose to do here. But one of them is that the participants make the association themselves between their identifier and the national identifier, and that they never disclose account numbers ever to anyone. So that is the association that is made between the FSP and their customers through national ID. And it's done in 2 places. Once inside of the FSP system, where they say, this customer has this national ID, I can therefore receive payments. The other, of course, is that the Oracle system itself can say, who should I talk to about this transfer? What we've said is that maintenance is a Mojaloop function. It wouldn't be a MOSIP function. And so the participants add and remove their association through the Oracle interfaces. They already exist, those interfaces. And so the work is laid out in front of us to where there's really nothing to do. The system already supports exactly what you're talking about. Someone needs to show up with a national ID system that needs to be integrated.
It's that integration that I'm really talking about. I think the rest is almost a given. It's just that integration.
So integration with MOSIP would be for what purpose? Again, we go to outcomes. What would you like to demonstrate?
To demonstrate
and if we can show that,
identity number that is presented is valid.
And I think if we could pick that out and workshop that with the MOSIP team and say, let's keep it simple, let's show that the basic integration uses what we already have on both sides. You're absolutely right that something's going to get built in the middle. That Oracle is going to be built by us, almost certainly, but let's keep it simple. Then we should be able to do that quite quickly, I think.
I think the interface with MOSIP is simply, we've got this national identity number. Is it valid? Is it a real number? Or has the person died, for example? So
it's the dip. It's usual stuff we dip. Our service interface is already defined. We know what we need out of each ID, and we don't need to worry about the particular context of that ID. We say it is an ID. It's an alias.
You just need to know it's valid, and then it's a matter of building the Oracle for this. I agree. We are in agreement on this. I don't think this is a big deal. We were approached by Pramod Verma, who I'm sure you know. I know him of old from working with the India Stack people. So, and he wants to coordinate this. He and a number of other people want to coordinate this between MOSIP, ourselves, and potentially the OpenG2P team.
That'd be awesome.
It's,
I mean, that's a good combination to workshop through this. Again, I'm being very careful to protect, put a machine gun nest around our architecture. This is how
Yeah.
we work, and
Yeah.
it's worked successfully. And that may mean doing some custom work on the side to make some of this work. But
yeah. But we're
Great, thank
only
you.
interested in doing the payments piece. We're not interested in any aspect of identity management or
correct.
Any form of identity validation beyond it is a real identity.
No, that's the purpose of an oracle, is to
Yeah.
say the oracle has the answers. You ask the oracle, and it
Yeah.
goes off and dips the database and pays the fee or whatever is required, and comes
Yeah.
back with a definitive answer of yes, and you can talk to Acme, or no, this does not exist.
Okay, we're in
Thank you.
agreement, I think. Yes. Okay, that's it for that, unless there's any other questions.